So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Positive Choices Late Lunch and Learn event. My name is Neil Hudson-Basing. I am the Corporate Events Manager at London South Bank University. Pleased to be supporting this event. I'm just going to take you through some virtual housekeeping before I hand over to Helen, who's going to introduce today's event. So just a short statement on respect and dignity first. Everyone speaking at or attending one of these events should be treated with respect, dignity and courtesy. Positive Choices operates an environment built on equality, inclusion and acceptance. We value contributions, feedback and comments and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating and bringing communities together. Positive Choices does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment or discrimination. Inappropriate behaviour will be treated seriously and acted upon. Anyone exhibiting any example of this behaviour will also be removed from the webinar. We want our events to be an enjoyable, safe and warm experience for all. Thank you for adhering to these guidelines. In terms of Zoom functionality, it's great to see people using the chat box already. Please continue to do so. It helps us to build up some networking and break down the virtual wall that we're all experiencing at the moment. You'll also see there's a Q&A box. Please reserve that for your questions for our panelists, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Don't forget that you can upvote on the questions you most want answered by clicking the thumbs up symbol, and that boosts them to the top of the question list and we can work our way through those. I have enabled closed captioning for this event. If you wish to hide the closed captioning, the subtitles, you can click on the little up arrow next to the closed caption symbol at the bottom of the page. You can also adjust the size of those there. If you have any questions during the event, I'm in the background, but I'd now like to hand over to Helen, who's going to introduce today's event.
Good afternoon, everybody. So Neil said it's a late lunch and celebrate. I just thought, well, I actually need to eat my lunch really, so perhaps that'd be a good idea in a few minutes. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce today's session to you, and particularly to introduce both speakers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ruth before we start off, and then I'll talk about James on a Sunday, but Jimmy every other day of the week, and how much I value them as colleagues and friends. So Ruth and I, as very, very young children, in June 1982, in separate hospitals, sat our state final examination. And another colleague who sat her finals on the same day has sent us that paper. Ruth didn't know this yet. She's got a copy of the paper, but in a few weeks, I'd like us to do some sort of a quiz to see how far we've moved on and who could actually do 5 essays from an 8-question paper in 3 hours, which is what we were expected to do. Ruth is an amazing practitioner. Not only does she walk the walk, but she talks the talk. And I think the best accolade I can give to Ruth is that a long time ago, it seems like now, we ran an event called Decide, Commit, Proceed in the Radisson Blu Hotel in Leeds with students, third-year student nurses who were being hot-housed. We were wandering about, the students were in a tea room, and they knew that Ruth was coming on next. And somebody said, I've not heard Ruth speak before. And this student said, oh my God, she's the woman that makes research sexy. So that is what we always say is Ruth's accolade for us. She is the woman that makes research sexy. But not only does she make it sexy, she makes it accessible to everybody, but she also makes it applicable. We all go off and do bits of research here and bits of research there, but whenever you read anything that Ruth has had her mitts on, you always know straight away how this will apply and how this will make a huge difference in people's lives. So it's amazing that she's here with us today. And then Sir Jimmy Riddle, what can I say about the young man, the transplant from Geordieland to Ormskirk? Well, little known fact about our Jimmy is that he managed to cut his honeymoon short to come to Positive Choices in Dublin, and with the approval of his wife, to come and speak to the assembled group about his experience in India. And I would be remiss if we didn't actually acknowledge, Jimmy, that one of the police officers that you worked with in India has lost his life to COVID in this last week. And we're really sorry for his family, and we're really sorry for his extended family, which includes you. But Jimmy is great fun. Jimmy makes the Restraint Reduction Network actually work. He sees the compassion that needs to be there, but more than the compassion, he sees the common sense approach. And if you remember that on the 1st of June, we will be 10 years since Winterbourne View aired on our screens, then this session is more pertinent than it ever was. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand over to you, Ruth. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Helen for that kind introduction. I've now got to try and do the technical bit and make sure that I can share my screen properly. Let's see if this will work.
Perfect.
Is that fine?
It is.
Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, as I said, thank you, Helen, for that introduction. Yeah, thinking back to that day in 1982 with the state finals, as we then had to do, it's quite funny because the one thing that I can remember from that day is that it happened to fall on a bank holiday. So in those days, when we were sort of salaried as student nurses, we actually got paid bank holiday pay, so double pay for doing our state finals. So that can't be bad. Okay, so this afternoon, Chris asked me to speak about research. Now, that's probably a blessing and a curse, because to me, I could probably keep you here for the next sort of 3 or 4 weeks just talking about research. However, I've only got half an hour or so. So I had to then think about, okay, so what did I want to talk about research? What was it that I really wanted to spend the time exploring with you? And I think, you know, as Helen sort of suggested in her introduction, to me, research is very much a practical subject. It's something which I'm enthusiastic about, but I also know that not everybody else is enthusiastic about it. I know that not everybody else feels confident with thinking about research. What I really want to do is just to spend a few minutes sort of going through with you why I think it's really important in the context of learning disability nursing. And yeah, I've got these sort of 3 different sort of areas that I want to explore. The importance of research for learning disability nursing, some examples of how research can make a difference. And that's what I really want to focus on, is that what we're doing is we're not just thinking about research for research's sake. We're thinking about how we can do research, how we can use research to actually make a positive difference in people's lives. And then to think about ways to get involved. What is it that we can do to try and take this forward? And in terms of the examples, I'm just going to use a couple of examples of research projects that I've been involved in, hopefully to show you how we can move from questions through to trying to make change in people's lives, trying to make services better, trying to improve things. So in terms of starting points, why is research important? If you look at your code of practice, the NMC code, it's quite clear from that we should be basing our practice on the best available evidence. Now, there's not always research evidence available for everything which we do. Sometimes it's difficult to access. There are certainly gaps in relation to some of the sort of evidence base around learning disability nursing. If you look back to strengthen the commitment, there was a clear sort of recommendation from that we needed to continue to build the evidence based in learning disability nursing. And I think we are making strides there. It's really good to see more people coming through, publishing research, undertaking research, doing things like PhDs. So I think we're developing in that area, but we obviously need to do more. But despite it being a professional requirement, some people still feel, I think, a bit reluctant to engage in research. And I think that's for a whole variety of reasons. It seems to have got this sort of reputation as being something which is too difficult, too complicated. It's not really always relevant. Now, you know, I teach nurses and, you know, we have to put our hands up. Sometimes that's to do with how it's taught, but I also think it's probably to do with the sort of reputation it gets, that people sometimes think it's too difficult. You've got to do the research module. Whereas to me, research actually should be underpinning everything we do. It doesn't matter what we're studying, what we're doing in terms of practice. There should be, our thinking should be encompassing research. And really, for me, it's about wanting to make a positive difference. You know, if any of us think about why we came into nursing or why we came into whichever profession we have, and why we're still here, it's about wanting to make a positive difference. So what I'm really trying to sort of emphasize, I suppose, in this afternoon is actually research is one way that we can do that. It's one way we can make a positive difference. So I just want to start by taking you through one project that we've been fairly recently involved in. I want to go back right to the starting points, even before the project. And I saw in the sort of attendees sort of list there, we've got people from Improvement Cymru listening into this. So that's great, because this was something which we did in partnership with Improvement Cymru. So going back to 2017, myself and colleagues did a review of hospital passports. We looked at a whole range of passports that had been sort of produced, because we were interested in trying to see what was common about them, you know, how they'd been developed, what uses they were going to be put to. So we looked at these hospital passports, and we sort of identified what were the key areas of information that people included in them. And what we found was huge variation in terms of the length, the format, and the information that was included. So in terms of length, I think they varied from something like about 3 pages to 37 pages. In terms of format, they all had very different formats. They all looked very different. In terms of the information that was included, that varied hugely. You know, for example, I think there were 3 or 4 that didn't include information on allergies, which you might think is pretty important in terms of this type of documentation. So what we concluded from that was that there were implications in terms of patient safety. And when I'm thinking about this, I'm normally thinking about, I don't know, the band 5 or band 6 nurse who's in the accident and emergency department. Somebody with a learning disability comes in, hands this document to the nurse. Now, if that nurse doesn't recognize that document, they haven't seen it before, it could be, you know, if it's one of the ones that's 37 pages, they've got to make, you know, judgments in a fairly sort of fast moving situation. They've got to really try and get care to people. It's an emergency department. So how are they going to use that document? Are they going to see it as relevant? Are they going to have the time to work through a huge document? And are they confident in knowing that, okay, if I turn to page 3, I'm going to find the information on the medication, for example. So there's lots of patient safety issues there that could arise because of this huge variation. So what we recommended was that really what was needed was a single document that was going to be universally recognised and used. So fast forward a couple of years, and Improvement Cymru, as part of the Improving Lives programme that had been sort of rolled out by Welsh Government, put out a tender for the development of an all-Wales health communication tool for people with learning disabilities. Myself and colleagues at the University of South Wales, so I was working with Edward Aloidi and Stacey Rees, we put in the tender, and we were lucky enough to secure that and to get the contract to undertake this piece of work. So what we did was take that original piece of work that we'd done looking at the tools. We looked at some tools which have been developed since then, but we also started to gather information from key stakeholders as what they thought was important, because we were working from the basis that if you've got something which people feel is actually meeting their needs, it's more likely to be used, it's more likely to be valued. So what we did was we tried to get information in 2 different ways. We developed an online survey which was available. We put it out via sort of social media. It was out via a whole range of things. We sort of emailed people, we used networks. And within that, we took the areas of information that had been identified in the review that we'd done. We asked people to rank them. I think there was 39 areas, and we asked people to identify what their top 10 were, and in order of, if you know, in terms of importance. And what we were stressing was this was about patient safety. So in terms of keeping people safe within the context of healthcare, what were the 10 most important items on that list? We also identified, or we asked them to identify how long they thought the document should be, and the format, you know, should it be in paper, should it be in digital, should it be both? And we gave a box for sort of open sort of comments. we also recognised that online survey was probably not going to be accessible to people with learning disabilities. So what we did was we then ran 4 focus groups with people with learning disabilities. And basically we went through the same process, but we adapted our way of gathering the information. So instead of having the online survey and asking people to rank it, what we did was we took each of those items, put them on a card, put it into Easy Read, put a picture with it, and then Ed and Stacey facilitated a discussion with 4 groups of people with learning disabilities, and we did almost like a card sorting exercise. So people were asked to put on one pile the cards, the items of information which they thought were really, really important, that they should be in this sort of particular tool we were developing, and there was another pile for ones which were not important. We did have a third pile which was unsure, but actually as it came to it, people felt that they didn't need that unsure. They either wanted to go into the yes, this is important, or no, this isn't important. So we had quite a lot of participation within that. In terms of the online survey, we had families and carers, we had people from third sector, people from social care, we had people who were working in learning disability health services from a range of professions. And we also had people working in generic health services from a range of professions. So a really good sort of overview of people, key stakeholders that hopefully would be using this tool once we developed it. And that was important because if you looked back at some of the previous research that had been done, it didn't seem that acute hospital staff or acute healthcare staff had always been involved in some of the development. Their views had not always been sought on some of this. So we wanted to get a really wide sort of perception of this, so we could be fairly confident that what we were producing was going to be meeting people's needs. What I have to say is, if any of you have ever done a survey, you'll probably know that, you know, no matter how careful you are with the questions and how you phrase them, people will always answer it in the way that they want to answer it. And it was quite funny because we asked people, there was this list of 39, we asked people, okay, list them in order, you know, your top 10, and some people put 1 against everything, some people put 1 to 10 but carried on all the way down to 39. Some we had to sort of discount because if you just put 1 for everything, we couldn't prioritize on that, but we could include others because we could have that cutoff point of 10. So we analysed that in 2 different ways. One was we looked at what were the ones which were most commonly sort of put as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we also looked at all of them where people had put them in their top 10. And so we had 2 different lists. We compared that with what we got from the focus groups. There were slight differences, but there was also quite a lot of agreement about what was important. So what did we find? When we looked at the survey, there was over 70% of people said it should be no more than 4 pages in length. But what was quite interesting was that, having said that, people then also said, but actually all of this information is really important. We need to get all of this in, and it's quite difficult to square that circle. How do you get everything into 4 pages? But there was general consensus about what were the most important areas to include. And I suppose one of our light bulb moments came when we thought about what had been said in the focus groups with people with learning disabilities. Because what had come through from that is that some of the discussion had highlighted how some of the things which are commonly on hospital passports, they might be important for some people, but they're not important for other people. So people were saying things like, well, I know, you know, religion's not important for me, but I also know it might be important for somebody else. Or, you know, having help with help with feeding and things like that. That I really know that that's important for some people, but it's not important for me. So we then got down to the idea of, did we need to have huge long lists of information, or would it be better to think about broad areas and allow people to perhaps personalize more? So what we did was we recommended that the document should be no more than 4 pages long. But what we should do is go away from having lots of sort of very specific questions to broad areas that would allow for greater sort of personalisation. Those broad areas would encompass the areas where there was greatest consensus about what was important. But what we also wanted to do was to develop guidelines to support completion and use, because obviously if you're giving a broad heading, it's important to give guidance about what type of things should be there. So we then moved on to developing the tool. So we developed a prototype, we developed the prototype guidelines, and we then got together a sort of a stakeholder group, which we were really lucky in terms of timings. I think it was actually the week before lockdown, so a week later, and we wouldn't have been able to get in the same room with people to discuss this. But it was really important because what came back from that was a few things which we probably hadn't thought about. There was discussion about the format and that, and whether 4 pages was enough, some of the things that should go into the guidelines, and the importance of it being a very recognizable tool, something which everybody would recognize. So if somebody brings this document into whatever healthcare setting, the healthcare staff will recognize that as something which is important that they need to sort of focus on. They need to use the information there. We revised it slightly and then produced the final version, which was then all submitted to Improvement Cymru. But research is only one part of this. You know, hopefully what I've shown you is it's come from, if you want, a clinical problem, a clinical issue. There were questions. We started to find out some answers to that about what was happening in terms of passports. We then got the chance to do more research to try and take that further to develop something which was evidence-based. But once you've got that, you've really then got to pay a lot of attention to, it's almost like the so what factor. You know, you can produce a lovely piece of research, you can publish your articles, but actually if that doesn't make a difference, if that doesn't get to the people who need to use it, it's not going to affect change. So from that sort of point onwards, we've worked very closely with Improvement Cymru, who put on a soft launch. Again, you know, it hasn't been possible in the last year to bring people into the same room to talk about this. But we had a very good launch online, which the Chief Nursing Officer was part of, talked about the importance of this. Different people gave different perspectives. We then also had a webinar within Patient Safety Week, to try and sort of really locate it within that sort of area of discussion. And there's also been a lot of local implementation. For example, One People First group has got some funding to do peer support to assist people to complete this. Student placements, as I'm sure a lot of you all have probably experienced over the last year, have sometimes been quite challenging, but some people have used them quite imaginatively so that the students have been providing support to people to complete their health profiles, and also having people who are championing this in various different areas. And then recently there's also been a social media campaign, and I've put the link on there at the bottom, which takes you through to the documentation, the guidelines, but it also gives you, there's a small animation, some of you may have seen it on Twitter and things like that, but really trying to sort of get the message out there. And also alongside this as well, we're now starting to think about, okay, what more do we need to do to push some of this, but also how do we evaluate it? Because research is it should be a constant cycle. Questions, investigation, answers, implementation, which then takes you round to further questions. So that's where we're at with that sort of project. And to say, the reason I wanted to share that with you was, for me, it's really an example of how, if you want a clinical issue, research, put them together, and you can then hopefully work towards changes in practice. But the other sort of area I wanted to share with you about making a difference is to look at it from the perspective of people with learning disabilities and research, and to think about making a difference through participation in research. Now, some of you will have heard me talk in the past about this project, the Looking Into Abuse project, which we completed a number of years ago. The idea for this research actually came from our Teaching and Research Advisory Committee. And for those of you that don't know, at the University of South Wales, probably for about the last, I think probably about 18 years now, we've had a group of men and women with learning disabilities who meet with us monthly. They advise us on teaching, they're involved in teaching, they're involved in interviewing students, they're involved in teaching and assessing students, but they also are involved with us in developing research. And we, a number of years ago, took to them a report which we'd done around a project which looked at safeguarding, and we asked them if they would help us to put that into Easy Read. They said yeah, but they said actually we also want to do some research and we want it to be around abuse, and And we want to be actively involved in this because, as they put it, nobody asked people with learning disabilities about abuse. And yet they knew that it was an issue for some of them and also for some of their friends. So we went through a whole process, and I haven't got time to go through all of this now in terms of how we developed that project, but it was very much about people with learning disabilities driving the project, being the people who were making the key decisions. We also employed 3 people on a part-time basis as co-researchers to work on this project. And one of the things which we did when we were looking at this, when we wrote it up, we wrote it up in terms of the findings, in terms of, what did we find out about what people thought about abuse and keeping safe. But we also looked at writing up how we went about doing the project, about what we learned about how we worked together. And as part of that, the 3 co-researchers that were working alongside the paid researchers decided that they wanted to write a paper about becoming a researcher. And how we wrote that, we talked about it. I supported them to write it. We talked about what they wanted to put in. We sort of drafted it, took that back, worked on it for a number of weeks, and eventually did get it published. And we've got the sort of reference here. But what I want to highlight is that making a difference through research can be about the findings, and it should be about the findings, but it can also be about taking part in research. It can be about being part of that research process. And I've included a couple of quotes there, which are from this paper, which come from the co-researchers. They're saying having a job and working as a group are important to all of us. Meeting other people, working with other people have been good. It gives us a sense of satisfaction, and we feel we're helping people. We're more confident. And also we feel we've learned a lot by working as co-researchers. And, if you read the paper, you'll see, people learned skills which were transferable into other areas of life. It was a valued position. People felt valued. And it really did. I think the comment there about we're more confident, I can think of one of the co-researchers who at the beginning of the process, I can still remember them coming into a meeting with their head down, not really talking to anybody. And at the end of the project, this was somebody who went off with one of my colleagues to speak at an international conference and was quite happy to do that. So making a difference, isn't always about the findings. It can also be about how we engage in research and how we become more confident. Both people with learning disabilities and also people, who haven't got learning disabilities. But it can be engaging in research, can be exciting. It can also be confidence boosting. And it can be enjoyable, or at least I think it's enjoyable. So if we didn't have research, what would we have? Well, we wouldn't find answers to important real life questions. And I'm sure all of you in your day-to-day practice are constantly questioning, it's why does this happen? Why doesn't that happen? I wonder if this could be done differently. I wonder what we know about that. I wonder if anybody else is doing this. Those questions are the starting point for research. And without research, we wouldn't find the answers to some of those. We're not able to demonstrate effectiveness. So it's very difficult to be able to say, if we do this, if you have a learning disability nurse or you have an OT or you have whoever, and they do this, this is what you can expect will be the outcomes. It might mean that we're delivering care and support that's not effective. Really, really importantly, it might mean that the opportunities for the voices and views and experiences of those we support to be heard are going to be missed. People don't get the opportunity to have their voices heard in research, and our knowledge and practice don't advance. I don't know whether there are any of our students on the call, but if there are, they would have heard me say, I look back, and Helen's told you how long we can look back. I look back at some of the things we do and think, did we really do that? Why on earth did we do that? But what I hope is that in 10 years' time, the students that I'm supporting now are also going to look back and sort of say, did we really do that? Why did we do that? Why weren't we doing something differently? Because if we don't have research and if we don't use research, our knowledge and practice don't advance. We stand still, and that's not what we want to do. So how can we get involved? How can we make a difference? Well, at a very basic level, participating in research. There may be opportunities for all of us to become research participants. Some of you at perhaps over the last year may very well have been engaged in some of the research around COVID, and you think about the huge implications that that's had. We need to use research to inform our practice. Now, to do that, we do have to understand research. We can't just blindly take a research report and try and apply it in practice. We've got to have the skills of critical appraisal. We've got to be able to think about the strengths and weaknesses of the research. But think about why we're doing that. It's not just about learning about research. It's about learning about research so we can inform our practice, so we can practice more effectively. I talked about questions and ideas. I'm sure all of you have got lots of questions and ideas. Those can be the starting point for research projects, whether you conduct them or whether other people conduct them. But those questions and ideas are really, really important. And that links into the next one, being part of a research team. I always see research as a game sport, as a team sport, sorry. It's something which people come into for different roles. And, you know, I always say, my knowledge of football is not very good, but I know that a football match with one team that has 12 goalkeepers is not going to be a very good match. You know, people have got different roles to play, and that's the same in the research team. Some people may bring clinical expertise to a research team. Other people may bring sort of research experience to a team. Other people may bring lived experience to a research team. If you put all of those together, you actually get more effective research, you get better research, you get more relevant research. And that's what we should be aiming for. Some of you hopefully will go on to develop research projects, and some of you need to go on and need research teams and programs. We need to be building those up in learning disability nursing and more generally in learning disability. You know, we need to look at succession planning. We need to be making sure the next generation of researchers are coming through. And another way that we can make a difference, and perhaps one of the most important ways we can make a difference, is by supporting people with learning disabilities themselves to engage in research. And I would encourage you to look at that from two perspectives. We need to have research which is learning disability specific. We do need to focus on some of the particular issues which are pertinent to the lives of people with learning disabilities, which perhaps are experienced in sometimes in very different ways to other people within the population. But we also need to make sure that we're supporting the right of people with learning disabilities to engage in other research. You know, there's lots of research which goes on, things like cancer trials, things like other, you know, sort of trials around, I don't know, wound care, things like that. Sometimes if you look at those, one of the exclusion criteria will be people with learning disabilities, and you need to sort of start thinking why. We should really be giving the chance, or we should be supporting the chance of people with learning disabilities to engage in other research which is relevant to their needs, not just for the sake of it, but actually if this is an issue which affects them, they should have the same rights to participate as other people. But that may mean that things have to be done in a slightly different way. So sometimes we have to gather data in a slightly different way. We have to produce accessible information. Think about it, those are skills which should be central to all of us as learning disability professionals. So we've got a key role to play there in supporting people with learning disabilities to engage in research if they want. So I hope that I've given you some food for thought about why it's really important that we do engage in research, and about how we can use research to really make a difference to the lives of those we support, and also how we can use it to advance our professional development and how we can develop our practice through using research. So I've got as the last slide any questions. All of the questions are going to be taken at the end, but if you have got any questions from that, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to pick up on those at the end point. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over, I think, to Jimmy. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, Ruth. I'll try and do what I want, do what you've just done, and share my screen. Okay. Can people see that? Am I doing that right, Neil?
Perfect.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Wow. what a person to be following in relation to this. And thank you so much for the team for inviting me to talk about restrictive practices. Restrictive practice is something that I'm very passionate about. I know some of the people who are here today will have heard me speak about restrictive practice previously, but I just want to start off with just acknowledging the gentleman who Helen made reference to, and this is a guy called Rahul Kumar, who unfortunately lost his life yesterday in India to COVID-19. He was the founder of a project looking at how police can engage with people with intellectual disability in rural India. And he developed the program called Sahas, and he was very successful in that. And he was my friend, and I'd like to dedicate this to him, which is also poignant, bearing in mind when I did speak at Positive Choices in Dublin, as Helen said, it was in relation to my time that I spent with the Sahas team in India. Okay. So when I think about restrictive practice, I think about under what circumstances do we tend to use or to consider restrictive practice. And one of the things that we tend to use restrictive practices in is in relation to the management and challenging behavior. And I think what I try to do when I think about this is I focus on two things. I look at the definitions of challenging behavior. And I think most of us on this will be probably familiar with Eric Emerson's definition of challenging behavior, which is he completed in the late 80s. Professor Jim Mansell, I remember talking about the fact that challenging behavior is not about individuals, it's about the challenge to us as services. And that's something I feel really, really quite passionate about. It's never about the individual, it's about what that makes us think about. And we know that restrictive practice is sometimes a response that we need to look at. It's one of the reasons why I use the first definition on the left-hand side, which is, it feels a bit like a rewrite of what Eric and Jim were talking about. But the reason I use this is because it acknowledges the fact that when we are working with around behavior, that some of our responses can lead to restrictive practice. We know about aversive and exclusive practice. We know that was something that Jim and Eric referred to in the past. But I think what's important for me here is the fact that we're acknowledging in 2007 with the Unified Approach document that actually some of our responses to challenging behavior are restrictive. And can I just point out, I hate the term challenging behavior. It's not one of my favorite terms at all. And of course, the other thing is when we think about behavior, when we think about how and why people present with behaviors where our responses may be required, that actually what we're recognizing is that actually it's about unmet need. So for me, as a learning disability nurse, I think my job is about trying to establish what's happening for that individual. What are their unmet needs? What are they trying to tell me? Not how am I going to respond, in relation to their behavior, although that response will be necessary, but actually what is missing? What can I do to support that individual? So therefore, I tend to use Dave Bretoniak when he made that very clear point about the fact that difficult behaviors result from those unmet needs, that they're messages that we need to translate. And I think for us, some of what we do is about translation. It's about finding the different language. Because as Dave says, I believe all behavior is meaningful. And one of the things I would say is this next slide is probably the best definition of response to challenging behavior I think I've ever come across. It's by a guy called Dr. Rob Horner. And what he said was that it's not our job to fix people. I teach students about restrictive practice. I talk about the fact that we don't have Bob the Builder dungarees or all the equipment. Our job is not about fixing people, but it can be about designing more effective environments. And when we think about effective environment, we're thinking about communication, we're thinking about and when I ask people about this, and I'm sure if I asked you now, probably a lot of people would think about the bricks and mortar, what's going on around the person. But I think the other thing for me is about an effective environment, about what is happening internally. Environment is a very broad statement. It's not about us fixing people, but it is about us understanding and designing a more effective environment for that individual. And that can be an external environment, that can be a sensory environment, but that can also be an internal environment. And, you know, thinking back to what Ruth was saying about the information that needed to be held within the health passport, that is really, really important information if we're going to design an effective environment for somebody to be in at point of crisis or difficulty. So this is probably the one that I focus on the most when I think about kind of restrictive practice, when I think about the fact that it's not just about bricks and mortar and things around, staff around, it's about all of the environment, the internal environment for that individual too. We know that what's been discussed is that when we think about responding and supporting individuals, and certainly I work very, very much from a positive behavioral support methodology, that actually we really need to understand what that behavior is trying to tell us. Part of that is about response, that proactive response. So recognizing that actually we might need to think about environment, we might need to think about things that impact on me, that make me change my emotional state, positively or negatively, developing my skills. Yeah. Reinforcement-based approaches, I think, are sometimes a really difficult thing, but they are important because I think we all have some aspect of reinforcement. But when we think about restrictive practice, we tend to make reference to those in more reactive approaches. So we are presented with an individual who may be distressed, or a particular scenario that is going to be particularly challenging, not necessarily just for the individual, but could be challenging for us as a service. So actually we need to think about how we are going to react, how we are going to manage, how we're going to support that individual through those things. And I like the aspect here in Adams and Allen talking about those self-protective matters. I've worked with lots of people where we've talked about some levels of restriction being identified as their own self-protective procedures. And, you know, we work with some individuals who will self-restrain as part of a reaction to being overwhelmed by the environment around them, or indeed their internal environment. And then we've got good old Fred. And Fred is experiencing some form of restrictive practice. And when I use this slide, and when I refer to this slide, you know, it's quite clear that Fred is, for me, being restrained. He's been restricted. It's not physical restraint; it's mechanical restraint. He's got his legs up. But for me, this is punishment, and we don't. However, unfortunately, what we have seen, or what we have seen with the likes of Winterbourne View, Walton Hall, Muckamore Hospital in Northern Ireland, is that some of the approaches that are taken in response to people presenting with what people perceive as challenging behaviour are punitive action. There is no development of an understanding of what's happening for that individual. I think back to the scenes of Walton Hall, where staff were sitting outside a young woman's room talking about the man bomb. That is a significant restrictive practice. That is there purely to influence that individual's behavior. That, for me, is a punitive action. And we're not about that. And restrictive practice should never be about punishment. However, again, unfortunately, if you look at some of the experiences that children and young people in education are experiencing, families will talk about the fact that they feel their children are being exposed to restrictive practices, restraint, mechanical seclusion, or calm down rooms. And actually, if we considered that, if we looked at that in terms of definition, we would probably make reference to the fact that these are quite punitive factors. And for me, restrictive practice should never be used in that format. It should never be used as a punitive action. So I want to start thinking about restraint. So restraint, you know, the intentional restriction of a person's voluntary movement or behavior. You're probably not familiar with Counsel and Care. Counsel and Care, we're an organisation specifically related to older people, and it was people living with dementia. And this was the definition that they came up with in conversation with people who were living with dementia, some people with behaviours that were that needed at times to have a reactive response or a supportive response, but also families and carers as well. And what they said was, you know, that is that intentional restriction. And I think one of the things here is, you know, we're using it as a restraint. But you know, one of the things I would say is that when we think about restraint, lots of people think only of physical, hands-on intervention, and actually that is only a form of restrictive practice. And actually, what we, although it's more out, you know, it's more tangible to look at physical interventions. So the team of, you know, the teams of 2 or the teams of 3, etc. And having been a restraint trainer myself, or restrictive practice trainer in the past, you know, I was part of the teaching teams who were teaching at the time physical techniques that involved a certain number of individuals. But physical restraint is only a form of restrictive practice. It is not the only form of restrictive practice. And that's really, really quite important, because I think we need to understand what restrictive practice is, so that because of the impact it can have on individuals, including ourselves. This is from the positive and proactive document, and what they said at the time was, and you know, and some of this was in response to some of the things that were seen at Winterbourne View, certainly in terms of restraint and restrictive practice. You know, that deliberate act on a part of a person to restrict that person's movement, liberty, and/or freedom. And then I look back 12 years before that, and a document that was written by a voluntary organisation was basically saying the same thing. 3 years before the Mental Capacity Act, talking about deprivation of liberty, talking about acts that restrict movement, liberty, and/or freedom. It's about, what they said was that it was about taking that immediate control of a dangerous situation, and of course that will need to be justified. Where's that real possibility of harm to the person or others if no action is undertaken? So we are recognizing that actually our approaches may involve some form of restriction, but I think the key point here is that actually we're looking at you know, a particular level of support, and I do believe that we need to be very clear about our justification for the use of restrictive practices, about that ending or reducing significantly the danger to the person or others, and containing or limiting the person's freedom for no longer than is necessary. And we talk about least restrictive practice, we talk about last resort, and you know, I'm very much working with organisations around reducing restrictive practice, and I know some colleagues on the line are working with other organisations whose aim is to reduce, not reduce restrictive practice, but eliminate restrictive practice. And I think that absolutely should be a goal. I'm not saying that everybody will, I'm not saying that will be for everybody, but I think we need that as our absolute end goal. That should be our golden standard, to the fact that we are able to meet the individual's needs to a purpose, to a point where actually we don't need to use any forms of restrictive practice or restraint. But we can only do that with a lot of other work happening. We can't necessarily do that at the point of an event, a crisis event, because for most individuals that may be a time when actually they need very, very clear support, and some of that support should be guided by them too. Couple of documents here from the RCN. So the 2017 document is 3 Steps to Positive Practice, and they talked about the fact that when we think about interventions, we're thinking about physical, emotional, psychological, mechanical, or pharmacological, that they're time limited, they're used as a last resort, and they should be withdrawn at the earliest opportunity when they're no longer needed. Any type of intervention, and this is the second part, any type of intervention which is mechanical, physical, environmental, and I think what's really quite important here is that notion of social intervention as a restriction, where it's used to intentionally or unintentionally limit someone's liberty. There are examples of social, coercive, psychological restrictions being used with individuals, by families, by carers, potentially some families, as a way of intentional or unintentionally limiting someone's free liberty. But there's the justification for that is key. And actually what we should be looking at is what is it that we need to be doing to support somebody differently. An example that was once given to me was actually a mental health nursing colleague who said that they witnessed a care team in a residential service explain to a gentleman who was getting up from his chair, and basically what they said was, "Don't worry, Jim, Mary's coming to see you this afternoon, so you just stay there." Now that is a social intervention, that is a restrictive intervention, because they know and an intentional social intervention, because what was happening there was actually Mary, this gentleman's wife, had passed away. she wasn't coming this afternoon, and actually it was a way of stopping him walking around the service, creating difficulties for the team. It was an intentional restriction of his liberty, but it was a social control. The other thing here is about clinical holding. Clinical holding is sometimes seen at the lower end of the restrictive practice kind of ladder, for want of a better word. And Lucy Bray, who's a colleague of mine at Edge Hill and others, and I was involved in the review of the children's document, which is the RCN 2019 document, where they talked about clinical holding having a different interpretation. That it was based on the intention of the hold, the agreement of the child. So there was some restriction of liberty and movement, but there was much more of an agreement in terms of how it was useful as a response to support anxiety, etc., in relation to clinical procedures. And I myself have been involved in clinical procedures where we've used clinical holding, a restraint, a restrictive practice, a restrictive physical intervention in line with the supporting the individual to, say, for instance, have blood tests, etc. And I know this is something that comes up quite often in relation to kind of recognizing that actually clinical holding is still a form of restrictive practice. However, we need to, and the same level of understanding around why and what and where we need to do with this. So I call it the 5 senses type of approach, so using all our senses to think about actually what's going on, what do we need to do here, regardless of whether it's a clinical hold, so it's a planned intervention. We've worked very, very closely with the individual. They know they're going to struggle with this, and they're a part of the process of understanding, to the same point where somebody is in crisis, with their emotional control is limited. They're really struggling with their experiences at that moment in time. I'll go back to the old RCN 2008 document. Let's talk about restraint, and it's out of print now. It's I don't even think it's due for review. But one of the things, and the reason I still use it is because actually chemical, mechanical, physical, and psychological restrictions are still used. When we think about chemical restrictions, we can talk about, the classic one for us at the moment, and certainly in legislative practice, is the STOMP agenda, the overuse of psychiatric medications, antipsychotic medications being prescribed for people with behavioral difficulties. But it's not just prescribed medications that can fall into that. Alcohol, antihistamines. When I was first started doing this work, the old cough bottle that you used to get from the chemist was actually identified as an over-the-counter chemical restriction. However, in clinical practice, we may be using things like risperidone, lorazepam, diazepam, rapid tranquilization. These are chemical restrictions. In terms of mechanical restraints, we could be talking about bedsides. We could be talking about soft cuffs, so mechanical restrictions, which sometimes are used in certain areas of clinical practice. But we could also be talking about lap belts, seat belts, door handles, lock doors, etc. So we need to be clear about what is forming processes of restrictive practice. What do we need to be clear about in relation to what are we doing? Where are we restricting a person's potential liberty and movement? Physical restriction, as discussed before, but that's psychological restriction, that understanding, that recognition of coercive practice. What we started to see, certainly, in the last, since before the publication of the Restraint Reduction Network kind of training standards, was that notion of observation. So we're not doing anything, we're not we're responding to the perceived needs of the individual, but actually being observed is a form of psychological restriction. It's a form of restrictive practice. Long-term segregation, Care Quality Commission and others have been doing a lot of work around long-term segregation. Technological surveillance, CCTV, Apple Watches that tell you where you are, coercive practice, just go back and I'll make you a cup of tea. You just stay there. Seclusion, as we know. And more recently, there's a big piece of work going on at the moment, and I've been involved in some of this work with the Care Quality Commission around blanket rules, blanket restrictions. No, you can't do this after 10 o'clock. No, you can't have a drink until 6 o'clock in the morning. These are forms of restrictive practice. These can influence and impact on the experience of the individual. And actually, they can also impact and influence on our approaches too. We know when I first started looking at this work in 2008, there was a document from C-Sky, which and it was interesting because C-Sky was the precursor to the Care Quality Commission. I know we've got people on the call from Wales and maybe from Scotland, but the Care Quality Commission at the time was C-Sky, and what they identified was, and this was very much around the needs of older adults, was that there was an increased risk of restrictive practices being used. Now, this was 2007 for people who are difficult or threatening, people who are non-conforming, therefore causing a management problem, and people who were less physically or mentally able. Now, in 2008, when I was looking at this originally, and I've been working on this since 2008, I thought, wow, we're quite a significant increase in the use of restrictive practices for anybody who meets one of those characteristics. And then I thought about my community caseload, and I thought, wow, my background is in patient assessment treatment services, and I still worked in services. And I thought, actually, I'm working with individuals who potentially could be characterized as having all three of those characteristics at once. So does that mean that we almost have 100% risk of a restrictive practice being used? So I wanted to make a difference about it. I wanted to understand that. I wanted to think about how we're going to do this differently. DH in 2014 and the NHS Protect programme talked about particular environments where there was an increased risk of restrictive practice, so acute psychiatric services, including forensic services, services for people with learning disabilities and challenging behaviour, older adult services where individuals may become agitated or confused, so people who may have been living with dementia, delirium, functional or organic mental illness. And certainly for the last 10, 12 years, I've been very, very interested in the needs of the older adult population, and specifically thinking about the needs of the older adult with a learning disability who may come into traditional older adult services where we not only face the factors that maybe C-Sky were making reference to in 2007, but we also go into environments where we know there are particular increased risks in terms of the use of experience of challenging behavior or even the use of restrictive practice. We know that these are some of the harmful effects related to the use of restrictive practice. I take on board Watson talked about this in 2001, but actually, if you think, we still talk about these things. We still talk about the fact that they can have emotional, physical, functional impacts by the use of restrictive practice. We can, if you think about the use of certain benzodiazepines can increase the risk of confusion and agitation. We know that the use of bedsides, for instance, can increase the risk of, and lap belts can increase the risk of morbidity and mortality. Unfortunately, there are far too many cases where individuals, young and old individuals, have asphyxiated because they've wriggled out of their harness or their lap belt, and we've seen evidence of strangulation, as it says there. But we're also looking at the emotional context here. Yeah. Depression, cognitive decline, reduced appetite. And those are things that are perceived by what's in the older adult general population. So, and for me, this, if you think about some of the needs of the individuals who we support, actually we're potentially increasing their risks exponentially by potentially using some of those restrictive practices. If we think about people with learning disabilities, well, Dave Ledbetter talked about all of these things, and they talked about particular aspects. You'll see that I've put question marks by elevated pain thresholds, because I've always had real difficulty in acknowledging that in relation to pain. One of the first things I ever remember being taught at university as a student nurse was homeostasis, and pain is personal. So the notion that when we're thinking about people with learning disabilities in relation to the use of restrictive practices is that they have an elevated pain threshold really makes me question where we are here, in terms of actually what we need to think about is that pain is personal. And that leads me nicely onto my next slide, which talks about trauma. And trauma and pain and that experience of emotional trauma. We recognize now we're much better at understanding, kind of looking and thinking about trauma-related responses. People may experience a higher level of restraint and restrictive practice because their behavior is influenced by trauma. So what we really need to be doing is thinking about actually how do we recognize and understand the individuals that we're working with. So positive behavioral support is not something that should be used only to reduce restrictive practice, because actually what PBS should do is increase quality of life outcomes and understand the person's unmet need. And a byproduct of that is a reduction in the use of, hopefully, the reduction in restrictive practices. One of the things that I'm very keen on is thinking about the rights of the individual. And I think as practitioners, we need to be absolutely categorically clear that anybody everybody has rights, and there are variations in those rights. But one of the things that none of us lose are some of our human rights. There are obviously qualified and absolute rights, so some of our human rights can be influenced by other legislation, by other circumstances, but human rights is across the board. And one of the things, this comes from a piece of work that was being done in Merseycare in the late 2000s, and I was a member of the team who was doing this work at the time. And one of the things I really liked about it was the fact that they'd taken into consideration how the Human Rights Act, as it was, could be used to identify and support positive management. It made us think about, when we were thinking about doing certain things, actually, does this impact on a person's rights? Does it have an influencing factor on a person's human rights? Because actually what we need to do is make sure that our responses, our thoughts, our risk assessments are proportionate, that they're balancing the rights of the service user, the individual. We know that, we know that there are legal and professional frameworks that we need to work to. So the Human Rights Act, the Mental Health Act, the Mental Capacity Act, the Equality Act, the Autism Act, and more recently, the Mental Health Unit Use of Force Act, or almost also commonly known as Cheney's Law, which hasn't come into full force yet. We're waiting on the statutory guidance, but for those of you who work in mental health provision, certainly I would suggest that this is something you need to be aware of, because there are recommendations and requirements of services in relation to this. We know from a professional perspective, we have our NMC Professional Code of Conduct. And for anybody who's not a nurse on the call, you may have other professional, ethical, regulatory frameworks to work from. Our contractual obligations, our employer, our accountability, and of course, for me, although it's our relationship with the people that we support, that we work with. When we think about codes of practice, these codes of practice, if you're interested in codes of practice, then Chapter 26 of the Mental Health Act Code of Practice looks at the safe and therapeutic response to disturbed behaviour. It looks at the use of restrictive practice, what we do, when we do it, why we do it, and how the Mental Health Act supports us in relation to that, but also challenges us in relation to what we need to think about. In terms of the Mental Capacity Act, then we have we've got Chapter 6 or that article. Chapter 6, sorry, is within the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice, and it looks at proportionate and necessary as well as least restrictive. And even when we are, when I think back to working around individuals who needed some support around having bloods taken, we absolutely needed to consider what was proportionate, what was necessary, and one of the most important aspects of that was what was the least restrictive approach that we had. And that included when we said, stop. This is not happening right now for this person, because that was a proportionate, it was a necessary, and it was a least restrictive and least a trauma or emotional trauma invoking response. When we think about reducing restrictive practices for people with learning disabilities, then for me goes back to what Rob Horner said. It's about those effective environments. So knowing a person's health needs. And when we talk about health needs, I'm very, very much an advocate of health being a global perspective, looking at the World Health Organization definition of health in the mid-40s. So not just looking at a person's physical health, looking at their physical health, their social health and well-being, their emotional well-being. When we're addressing health needs, we're looking at a much more global perspective and including that within people's health action plans. Knowing what a person's life story looks like. Some of the individuals that we work with will have experienced restrictive practices. They may well have experienced quite extreme restrictive practices. So we need to remember that when we're looking at how to support that individual with a view to reducing those restrictive practices. Making sure that what we do is person-centered. It's centered around the individual. I can't stress that enough. I think the most important part of reducing restricted practice, certainly at an individual level, is about understanding the individual, getting the individual to be a part of that journey. Behavioral assessments may be something that are used for particular individuals, but an understanding of behavioral approaches, positive behavioral support, where we've got a real focus on a much more global kind of positive outcome, I think would be really useful. The management of pain, not just physical pain, but emotional pain, trauma. Looking at your environment, is it too hot? Is it too cold? Some of the guys on the call may well be familiar with some of the stuff that came from the Promote and Safer Therapeutic Services agenda, where we even talked about colours of walls as an influencing factor for individuals in relation to their experiences. Reviewing somebody's medication. Yeah, if we're overusing PRM medication, then there may well be that this person needs to have a review of their medication. And one of the things I would absolutely say is not everybody needs to be on medication. That's clear. We know that. But polypharmacy, so the contraindication of medications and how that impacts on that internal environment. Capacity. People can be involved in planning when a restricted practice is required. I've certainly worked with individuals where we've thought about actually how would you like to be managed and supported. I have a great colleague and friend called Iris Benson, who is a lady with a diagnosed mental illness, and she's very open about this. And she talks about the fact that actually, at times, she has an advanced directive in play when she is poorly around the use of restrictive practice, because what she recognizes is that when she's poorly, when her mental illness, or mental health deteriorates, that actually she needs people to understand and take control. That's not going to be the same for everybody, but absolutely we need to be involving people in the decision-making processes. And communication, before, during, after. This is about understanding a more global perspective. And I think when we have that global perspective, we're more likely to be able to address reducing restricted practice. I think about environmental assessment. I think about safe wards. So Jeff Brennan and Len Bauer's work is great in relation to looking at clinical therapeutic environments and how they can be more supportive of individuals. It doesn't just focus on reducing restricted practice. It thinks about making a more therapeutic, supportive environment. Restraint Reduction Network. I've been involved with this team for quite a long time, and I was very fortunate to be asked to be one of the lead authors for the national training standards, which are now part of the contractual obligation for the NHS and will be part of Cheney's Law's statutory guidance. But I think if we're looking at it from an operational perspective, and I don't think you just need to look at it from an operational perspective, we talk about the things, the 6 core strategies. So making sure you've got good leadership, that you're measuring performance, that there's clear learning and development around the reduction of restraint and restricted practice. Providing that very personalized support, understanding what that looks like, not a blanket approach of we'll all do this for everybody, making sure that clearly is, personalized to the individual. Making sure it's communicative, that it clearly does what it says on the tin. I call it a Ron Seal moment. Yeah. Customer focused, because the 6 core strategy are an American approach, but focused on the individuals who use your service, who are a part of your service, and looking at continuously improving. And I've put on there about taking the pledge. There is the individual pledge to the Restraint Reduction Network, which I think, clearly I'm going to plug, seeing as I'm quite a significant, I significantly believe in this approach. And why do we do this? Well, we do this because I don't want to see things like this happening again. These are real cases. I haven't used any of the experiences of people at Winterbourne, Walton Hall, or Muckamore. I've actually gone back to the Joint Committee on Human Rights report that was written in the late 2000s. Not because I'm dismissing those experiences, I'm certainly not. But I think this is something that really clearly identifies where actually we need to be better at this. Yeah. This was these are real cases. A person had scoliosis, a visual impairment. She kept climbing the furniture, resulting in injuries. So they, rather than looking at the environment, looking at the support, bearing in mind the environment is not just about the bricks and mortar. She was strapped into a wheelchair. Now that has significant connotations in relation to persons' physical well-being, their emotional well-being, etc. And I think probably what's one of the hardest ones, and unfortunately I think still occurs now, is this. Kay, middle-aged lady with Down syndrome, she threw a couple of wall in a care home. I've had experiences of working with a lady who, and this really hit home because I had experience of working with a lady with Down syndrome who was in a care home. And it was the first anniversary of her mum's death. So instead of trying to find out why she'd thrown that cup, she was prescribed antipsychotic medication. I would hope that as we move forward with agendas like STOMP, with understanding better approaches, positive behavioral support, understanding that restrictive practices more than just physical restraint, that we recognize that positive behavioral support is much more than just reducing restrictive practice. It's about encompassing the individual, that actually we shouldn't be in positions, or we should see situations like this being completely, I would hope, eradicated. But I just want to finish off with one slide, and then is this one. I've used this since 2008 because I believe that if all you have in your toolbox is a hammer, then all the world looks like a nail. If the only approach that you have is to use a form of restrictive practice without understanding all the other stuff I've talked about, then everybody looks like a nail and you will only use your hammer. Put some links on there for you, some reading, referencing, etc. Wow. Thanks for that, guys. I can't get back in now. I have absolutely no idea what I've done there. Right, I'm back in.
Thank you very much, Jimmy and Ruth. If I can invite Ruth and Helen to join us on screen, that would be great. Thank you. So we do have some questions. So we're going to tackle those first, and then I'll hand over to our panel to see if they have any questions too. So our first question is from Peter, and it's quite a long question, so bear with me. We often talk about reflective and evidence-based practice and how this research can aid in our interventions and improve services. In my reading of some least restrictive practice literature, I've noted that taking part in interventions and gaining lived experience helps to embed the knowledge from research and also aids in talking with peers and patients about their experiences. Within our nursing studies and in practice, we look at and use de-escalation techniques. However, after speaking with NQNs, they advise that they wish that they had worked bank shifts to gain the experiences, both good and bad, to help inform their knowledge and practice. Given students are unable to gain experience in physical restraint in a practical physical sense, unless working bank shifts, how could this experience be better gained before qualifying? And that was for both of you. Ruth, are you happy for us to come to you first?
I'm just wondering, Jimmy's probably best placed to kick off on that one because it's probably more linked there, but.
Yeah, I mean, it just so happens Peter and I have had this conversation before. I think one of the things we need to be conscious of, you know, the new NMC educational standards in Appendix B does make reference to positive behavioral support, de-escalation, etc. And I think the thing, I think you can consider approaches to supporting people around de-escalation. De-escalation is not a physical approach. De-escalation is usually a communicative approach. And I think you can use that. I think there are lots of what some people refer to as soft skills that we can teach within the environment. I think the reality of teaching physical interventional skills, having worked in services for a number of years where physical intervention is taught routinely and continue to do so, I think I'm not convinced offers an educational aspect concept. I think as a nurse, as a clinician, I think what I would want student nurses to understand, or nurses to understand, is the impact of what happens before, the during, and the after, and not just remember what it was like to actually be holding someone using techniques that you've been taught by somebody like me.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think,
go for it, Ruth. No, I'll go to you.
No, what I was going to add to that was I think it's a difficult one because I think there's always so much that people would want to cram into 3 years. And, you know, to some extent, some of that does come with experiences you're going through. And I think Jimmy, you know, what Jimmy was saying about the understanding and the understanding of the before, the during and the after is what's really, really important. And thinking about I think you sort of said in your question about talking with peers and things like that. I think all of that is part of your educational experience as well. So I think it doesn't always have to be that sort of teaching of, you know, sort of interventions, as Jimmy was saying. It's part of a much wider package, and I think, you know, it probably needs to be seen in that way.
What I was going to say, after having lived through a variety of UKCC and NMC curricula where things have been included and whatever, and also been involved in the teaching of restraint, whatever, to student nurses when it was in an iteration of a curricula maybe 10 years ago now. For me, the thing that has always been missing is, and I'm not dismissing anything that you said, Jimmy, you know, I love you dearly and everything that you say. Sometimes in terms of what we say to students, it's that common sense approach. So, you know, I've nursed people who have wanted to be restrained just to have some physical contact with somebody else. So, and that is such a sad indictment in our society. Our tribe as nurses, be it mental health or learning disability, that person thinks the only way they can get some physical attention is if they're restrained. I've also been involved in inquiries where there have been young, and well, not necessarily always young staff, immature staff who have pushed a situation until they have to restrain because it stops them being bored. And that again is an indictment in terms of what we offer within the systems that we're working in. I put in the chat earlier, if you read the Politics of Mental Handicap, one of the things it advocates in there talks about high carbohydrate diets, or, you know, I worked with a charge nurse hundreds and hundreds of years ago who, if the lads were getting wound up, he would ask for extra potatoes and we'd have a Christmas dinner approach so that people were so stuffed after the dinner they couldn't get up and have a go or whatever. And I'm not advocating that either, but I am advocating, as in terms of what Jimmy says, is that we need to know why people are doing it. Why are people pushing, and why are people looking for that sort of a response?
Can I just add something quickly to that?
Yeah.
I think you know, as I think anybody who knows me well enough, I've you know, restraint, actual physical intervention should be, and usually is, an extremely short event in a person's therapeutic journey. And actually what we really need to be focusing on is what is happening around beforehand. We do need to understand the during, and we need to, but for me, from a student nurse perspective, you need to understand what my experience of being held is, not what your experience of holding me is. Because if you want an experience of holding, then you should get that in your training if that's what you need to do. And Pete and I have had conversations about this, but also about what happens after the event. That's learning. That's where the therapeutic knowledge and engagement and education for me comes into play. And I think if we get that, then actually we potentially are in a much better place to reduce the need to experience physical holding, because I've worked bank for 12 years and I can probably count on two hands how many times I've been involved in full physical restraint, because I've used all the knowledge and skills that I've been taught as a student by colleagues such as Julie Toms in the past, and my experience is good and bad to avoid use of restrictions, because I've been able to understand the before, what it's like during, and that includes supporting somebody during a time of crisis, but looking at what the lessons are to be learned afterwards. And I don't think you actually physically need to do that to be able to understand that.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I've put in the chat, you know, I don't know how many of you have ever listened to Yvonne Newbold, who is a parent, speak, and she runs this whole network which is around what happens because my child hurts me. And she talks about the fact that parents, it links into what you were saying, Jimmy, about social restraint, parents being frightened to take their child, whether it be a little one or a grown-up, anywhere where there's CCTV, in case they play up, for want of a better phrase again, and somebody then thinks that that child needs taken away.
Absolutely,
you.
and there's far too many examples of families feeling exactly that. I've worked with Beth Morrison, who
Yeah.
where the Scottish government and the Children's Commissioner and have been doing some fantastic work. And Viv Cooper, it's up with the CBF. No, you're absolutely right.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question from David, it's for you, Jimmy. Across the world, we have an emerging evidence base of the impact that restrictive practices have on increasing the likelihood of psychological trauma, injury, and death, whilst doing little to positively impact on people's behaviour. Why do you believe that we, as evidence-based professionals, struggle to reduce the use of this practice?
You're muted. Go
Right.
for it.
Okay. So, David, you're absolutely right. There is an increase in evidence base, and I think what we have to. I just want to take up a couple of points in your question. Really, I can see your question. Sorry. Restrictive practices aren't a positive approach. That would be my view. Restrictive practices can support people to access things that they want, they need, and I think that's the variation. And I think there's where we're using restrictive practices in response to crisis, emotional crisis, physical crisis, challenging behavior, which is a term I don't like. What we're missing there is actually why that person got to that point in the first place. And I think what we've got is we've got a position where for some practitioners, and I've got to say, I honestly believe that we are moving forward with this in terms of reducing the need and reliance on restrictive practices, that we start to recognize the individual. So trauma-informed care is a biggie within mental health provision, positive behavioral support, because it gives us a more global understanding of the individual. And I think when we understand an individual as an individual, we have the opportunity to reduce our reliance and need to use restrictive practices. And therefore, and one of the other things I would say is that what we're starting to recognize is actually some people come into services already traumatized. And I use Helen's example as a great example, because some of the children that Yvonne and families that Yvonne works with and Beth worked with and Viv worked with have had massive trauma histories in services, health, education, social care services. And that really does sometimes influence the approaches that we take. But I think we have a growing evidence base of recognizing that the individual is such an important partner in working with us around reducing restrictive practice. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We're going to try and fit our last two questions in, if that's okay. So Jimmy, again for you, do you have any advice, as I'm just about to start my final learning disability nursing placement at a forensic unit where I believe restrictive practices might be used? And that's from Penny.
Okay, well, my advice in relation to forensic environments would be look at the work by Jeff Brennan and Len Bowers in terms of safe wards. They've done some fantastic work looking at not necessarily focused on reducing restrictive practice actually, but looking at more supportive clinical therapeutic environments. I think one of the things I would say is, I've worked in forensic services for people with learning disabilities, and I've worked in forensic services for people with enduring mental illness. And I think there is a commonality. The commonality has to be the individual. Understanding and recognizing and knowing what's happening for that individual at that moment in time. Some individuals will come into forensic services because of trauma-related histories. So as people will make reference to, certainly I've experienced working with people who have had criminal activities that have brought them into forensic healthcare services. And actually what some of the approaches take is about understanding kind of what influenced some of that criminal behavior. You look at gang cultures in the States. A lot of what people do around gang cultures in the States isn't about breaking up gangs. It's about looking at the predetermining factors that lead people into gang-related culture. And I think that's sometimes part of what we need to do when we're working in services. What is your journey? I think for me, one of the things I've said before, and people, I think I might have said it when we were at the House of Lords, when we did the 100 years, is I take the journey with the people I support, recognizing what's come behind, but hoping to see what they say moving forward. And I think we need to do that together. And I think that would be my advice.
Could I just also say, Penny, that we are not advocating here as lecturers from other universities that you don't talk to the practitioners about what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it, because sometimes we can give you a bit of knowledge and you end up full of righteous indignation and think, bloody hell, that Helen Laverty or Jimmy Ridley said do this, do that and do the other, and it's out of context. But also bearing in mind that we are 10 years on from Winterbourne, do not be afraid to go to your link lecturer or academic assessor or whatever they're called from your university and say, I don't like this and nobody's giving me an answer. If somebody doesn't give you a good answer, then you need to know why.
Yeah, absolutely. And most people know I always advocate the why questions. Why are we doing this? Why aren't we doing this? Why can't I do it? Why can't they do it, etc. So I think the why questions are really, really quite important.
Thank you. That is all the time that we have now. Helen, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to try and share something in the background while you're talking. So please carry on.
Okay, so how on earth do we sum that up, apart from to say thank you so very much to Ruth and Jimmy for giving us their time and talent. You know, as lecturers, we've spent the last 15 months delivering our own material to our own students online, but then to come into this environment and willingly speak is an absolute gift for all of us. So thank you so very much for being here. Thank you once again to Neil for wearing another fabulous shirt. I love your shirts. It's part of my guilty pleasure about Lunch, Learn and Celebrate, actually seeing your shirts, but also for your time and talent that you give so freely to us. And without you, we wouldn't be able to do it. So
Very
it's
welcome.
a little bit of a plug for our session on the 25th of June. Steve, do you want to talk about that? He's trying to unmute.
Yes,
there we
sure,
go.
Helen. Yeah. On June the 25th, from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m, we're going to have a remembering and celebrating the lives of people with learning disabilities through the pandemic. This is going to be a mixture of singers, poems, readings, etc. But also my address is down below the picture, and also I put it on the chat room. So you can email me any photos or artwork you want to include, or got any suggestions for inclusion. Yeah, and also if you know anybody that passed away during the COVID, not actually of COVID, but actually died of anything, someone with learning disabilities, family members or staff, you can email me their first name and a town they're from, just so we don't break any consent laws. But yeah, so I welcome your suggestions and look forward to seeing you on the 25th of June. Thank you.
We could have a word cloud, Steve, of people's names, couldn't we?
Yeah, definitely. Great idea.
Yeah, and then we can have that floating in the background. So once again, thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe, stay happy, and rock and roll. There we go.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Jimmy and Ruth.